Today on Radio Boat Anchor, I'm going to repair this vintage 1983 Radio Shack Micronta dynamic transistor checker. The Radio Shack Micronta dynamic transistor checker, catalog number 22-025, first showed up on page 105 of the 1983 Radio Shack catalog. This transistor checker was the only offering of its kind in this catalog, retailing for $14.95 in 1983. The advertisement for this transistor checker boasted the following: test PNP and NPN silicon and germanium transistors. Makes go-no-go test on small signal and power transistors. Can be used to match the characteristics of similar transistors. Socket and hookup leads can be used for testing transistors in circuit. Output jacks for external meter or scope. The Radio Shack Micronta dynamic transistor checker is relatively compact, measuring only 2 3/4 by 4 3/8 by 1 3/16 inches. Unfortunately, this transistor checker is only designed to test bipolar junction or point contact NPN or PNP transistors. You will need a more sophisticated component checker like the MEGA 328 pictured here to check modern JFET or MOSFET transistors. This transistor checker uses a specially designed pulse generator which steps up an AC signal generated by the transistor under test to a value sufficient to light the LED. The brightness of the LED varies according to the magnitude of the output signal. The more output signal, the brighter the LED. The base current control knob can be rotated to decrease base current from 0 max to 100 minimum so that you can set collector current. The reading where oscillation stops, LED stops blinking, indicates a transistor gain. The greater the number, the higher the gain. The Radio Shack Micronta dynamic transistor checker can be used to match the characteristics of two transistors. If the characteristics of one transistor correspond to another, the base current control setting where the oscillation stops should be equal for both transistors. Initial testing. The Radio Shack Micronta dynamic transistor checker requires one AA battery for power. You must turn the transistor checker over in order to remove the rear cover. 2 screws must be removed in order to open it. A previous owner left a dead AA battery in this transistor checker. Luckily, it did not corrode. I installed a fresh AA battery in this transistor checker, but did not install the rear cover. You can test the battery in this transistor checker by moving the slide switch to either the NPN or PNP position, then momentarily touching the red and black leads together. This should trigger the indicator LED to flicker. I then proceeded to perform an initial test, placing a known good 2N3904 NPN transistor in the test socket. Then moving the slide switch to the NPN position. This transistor checker is in working condition. Restoration. This section has been labeled Restoration instead of Repair, as my Radio Shack Micronta dynamic transistor checker was in working order. The first step in the restoration process was to remove the AA battery. 3 screws hold the printed circuit board in place and must be removed. There is one electrolytic capacitor on the component side of the printed circuit board. It is a good idea to replace the electrolytic capacitor while you have the transistor checker apart. After 42 years, electrolytic capacitors lose their capacity as their electrolyte dries up. It is important to replace the electrolytic capacitor with the same capacity and same or higher working voltage. It is also important to observe its polarity when installing. Here is the new electrolytic capacitor soldered in place. I used the Yoxit D5 contact cleaner to clean the contacts of the slide switch and the wiper assembly of the base current control. Then Labelle 107 plastic-friendly model train oil was used to lubricate the innards of the slide switch. The base current control knob was removed so that the shaft could be lubricated. Reassembly and cleaning. The printed circuit board was then mounted in place with the LED on the component side threaded through the indicator hole on the front of the case. 3 screws hold the printed circuit board in place. The required AA battery was then installed. Then the back cover was installed. 2 screws hold it in place. The component checker was then turned over, and the base current control knob was then installed. I used my go-to cleaner, Windex, to clean the case of my Radio Shack Micronta dynamic transistor checker. Armor All was then applied to the case of the transistor checker to restore the sheen of the plastic. Final testing. I first tested my Radio Shack Micronta dynamic transistor checker using a known good 2N3904 NPN transistor. An interesting fact is that you could switch the collector and emitter connections and it still tests good. Maybe this transistor checker just checks for back-to-back diodes, which is the essence of a bipolar junction transistor. Next, the transistor checker was tested using a known good 2N3906 PNP transistor. Once again, you could switch the collector and emitter connections and it still tests good. Then I attempted to use this transistor checker to test the known good IRF9Z34 P-channel MOSFET or metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistor. As expected, the Radio Shack Micronta dynamic transistor checker will not successfully test anything but bipolar junction transistors. My final test was using this transistor checker to test an in-circuit 2N2222 NPN transistor. It is important that the device in which the transistor is installed in is powered down before the testing is to commence. This is one of my ham radio receiver projects. My Radio Shack Micronta dynamic transistor checker successfully tested the in-circuit transistor. Box repair. There was a noticeable rip in the Radio Shack Micronta dynamic transistor checker's box. I used Elmer's glue to repair it. This glue dries transparently. Weighted solder iron and alligator clip stands were used to hold the ripped cardboard ends together while the glue dried. Windex was used to gently clean years of dirt from the box. Armor All then brought back the sheen of this laminated box. Conclusion. Here is my Radio Shack Micronta dynamic transistor checker with instructions in its original box. This was a fun little repair, or in this case, restoration project. Unfortunately, this bipolar junction transistor checker has limited use in the world now dominated by FET or field effect transistors. Please like this post and subscribe to Radio Boat Anchor so that you're alerted to my future posts. Thank you.